The Chancel, from Obscurity to Italianate Makeover. As the Reformation took hold, the new order of worship had little time for ritual or setting aside parts of the church for special practices. Chancels became largely redundant and their stone altars removed. The emphasis of worship was on the Word of God through preaching or Bible readings. In the 17th century, Holy Communion, the replacement for the Mass, was rarely celebrated and never on anything like an altar. Under the Commonwealth in the 1650s, following the execution of King Charles I, parishes were instructed to use only a simple plain table covered with a white linen cloth for communion, and that it should be brought down into the centre of the church for use. Though the celebration of communion was rare, chancels were generally treated as an extension of the nave. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, things began to change, at least a little. Altars did not return, but the communion table started to occupy a set place, usually at the east end of the church, and the taking of communion at least once annually was a requirement for anyone seeking public office or exercising other rites. In 1758, John Wood the Younger, famous for his architecture in Bath, not only lived in the prebendal manor house, the Grange, next to the church, but as church warden he undertook a number of changes to the church itself, remodelling the arch between the nave and the chancel, removing an old wooden rood screen, and installing what was later described as a Tuscan-style reredos on the east wall of the chancel. This suggests that the communion table was, by then, a more decorated and revered object than before. As to the enlargement of the chancel arch, it is most likely that this was done to create more space, and we know from pictures from the middle of the next century that at least part of the chancel was filled with seating at that point. The most significant changes to the chancel, however, came in the 19th and early 20th centuries under the Ellacums, a father and son who together were successively curate or vicar in charge of the parish for a period of 99 years after 1817. The Ellacums were high churchmen. They were early adherents of a view of Christian worship that was inherently closely related to traditional and more ceremonial practices and rites. It's not entirely clear when each of the changes were made. In the 1840s, H.T. Ellacum reconstructed Wood's chancel arch, replacing the plasterwork with stone. Much of Wood's reredos was then replaced with Minton tiles, as was the sanctuary, the area around the altar, which may at this time have been given an additional step and rail, which would explain the rather awkward thresholds of the two doors on either side. The final part of this reordering was to install a choir, replacing the pews that had previously extended from the nave. The choir fronts, still in this church, were a part of this reordering. The large east window was designed and installed in the 1860s, replacing plain glass lights, and commemorates various members of the Hollyoake family who had died in India. It was, however, the son, Canon Henry Nicholson Ellacum, who undertook the final and more decorative changes to the chancel in the early years of the 20th century. The canon was a great traveller. Taking the opportunity of the expanding railway connections across Europe, he made a number of trips to Switzerland and northern Italy. In 1900, and in subsequent years, he visited Verona. There, in the church of Santa Anastasia, he was impressed by the rich red marble steps and by the pattern of the floor tiles. He made a sketch of some of them in his diaries, and much of the decoration of the chancel appears to have been influenced by his visits. As a result, the sanctuary steps at Witten were covered in imported red Veronese marble, while the floors were recovered in marble tiles cut in an interlocking pattern itself found in the church of Santa Anastasia, both on the section between the choir stalls and in the sanctuary beyond. A few years later, the marble decoration was extended, replacing the Minton tiles on the reredos with a memorial to Ellacum's elder sister Elizabeth, who died in 1910. The plans for this memorial suggest a colourful arrangement was intended. Unfortunately, the colour has not benefited from the passage of time. H. N. Ellacombe himself died a few years later in 1916. No further changes were made to the chancel for a further 50 years, when in the 1960s the choir stalls were repositioned in the east part of the nave. More recently, the choir stall fronts were placed on wheels with the intention that in future they can be moved within the nave and chancel as required. You can find out more about the Ellecombes, this church and its history by visiting our website at stmarysbitton.org.uk or by finding some of the other audio descriptions nearby.